Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. A scenic farm stretched under the morning sun, golden fields swaying in the breeze, the scent of freshly turned earth lingering in the crisp air. Jake Mitchell leaned back on his porch, coffee in hand, taking in the peaceful rhythm of his land. This farm wasn't just his home, it was his family's legacy, passed down for generations. Every morning started the same way. A slow sip of coffee, the distant crow of his rooster, and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. That peace, however, was about to be shattered. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a car too pristine for a dirt road, rolling up his gravel driveway like it had no business being there. Jake squinted as the sunlight bounced off its glossy hood, watching as a woman stepped out with a kind of determined stiffness that screamed trouble. She was dressed in an immaculate beige pantsuit, her heels sinking slightly into the soft earth as she strode forward, clutching a clipboard like a weapon. "Mr. Mitchell," she called, her voice clipped and businesslike, the kind that didn't ask so much as commanded. Jake took another slow sip of his coffee, eyes flicking over her with mild amusement. "That's me," he said, not bothering to stand. "I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Crestwood Estates Homeowners Association," she announced, straightening her shoulders as if her title alone should make an impression. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Crestwood Estates?" "Yes," she said, flashing a tight-lipped smile. "Our neighborhood sits just beyond your property line, and we've been experiencing some concerns regarding your land." Jake let out a slow breath, already sensing where this was going. "Concerns?" he echoed, setting his mug down. Karen nodded sharply, flipping open her clipboard. "We've received multiple complaints regarding the aesthetic impact of your farm. Your red barn, for instance, it's quite bold. A neutral color would be more in line with the overall look of our community." Jake stared at her. "You want me to repaint my barn?" Karen didn't miss a beat. "And the rooster," she continued. "I've heard some of our residents have expressed frustration at being woken before sunrise." Jake rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "You mean the rooster doing what roosters do?" Karen's smile was polite, but her eyes flashed with impatience. "Mr. Mitchell, property values are a delicate matter. The presence of an industrial-style farm so close to a planned residential community can be disruptive." Jake let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Lady, I've been here long before that suburb popped up. My land isn't part of your HOA, and I sure as hell don't answer to your rules." Karen's expression stiffened. "I was hoping we could resolve this amicably. After all, we're all neighbors here." Jake leaned back in his chair. "We ain't neighbors. My land ends at that fence, and everything past it is not my problem." For a long second, Karen stared at him, her knuckles tightening around the clipboard. Then slowly, she smoothed out her expression, going one last attempt at diplomacy. "I'd hate for this to become a more complicated issue." Jake exhaled through his nose, unimpressed. "Well, Miss Whitmore, you go ahead and do whatever you think you need to, but my barn stays red, my rooster keeps crowing, and my farm stays just the way it is." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll see about that." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back to her car. Jake watched her go, shaking his head. He had dealt with stubborn animals before, but something told him Karen was going to be a whole different kind of problem. The trouble started almost immediately. First came the letters, formal notices stamped with HOA insignia, demanding compliance with neighborhood standards, each one more absurd than the last. Then came the complaints, anonymous calls to the county about supposed violations, zoning infractions, noise disturbances. Jake ignored them at first, but when he found a county inspector snooping around his property line, he realized Karen wasn't bluffing. And then, just when he thought she might give up, she showed up again. This time she wasn't alone, flanked by two stern-looking HOA board members. Karen stood at the edge of his land like a queen, surveying unruly subjects. "You again," Jake said, wiping his hands on a rag as he stepped away from fixing a section of fence. "Mr. Mitchell," Karen greeted, sighing as if this was some tedious formality rather than a battle she had willingly started. "I was hoping we could handle this civilly, but you continue to ignore our requests." Jake crossed his arms. That's because your requests are ridiculous. Karen handed him a stack of printed documents. As per HOA regulations, Jake interrupted, waving the papers dismissively. She pursed her lips, ignoring him. All properties within visual range of Crestwood Estates must adhere to community aesthetic guidelines. We are prepared to take further action if necessary. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. Lady, you're not my landlord. You don't have any authority here. One of the board members, a wiry man with thick-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. We have been in contact with county officials regarding zoning laws. If your farm is found to be in violation of certain regulations, you may be subject to fines. Jake's amusement faded slightly. He knew his farm was in full compliance with agricultural zoning, but he also knew people like Karen, Doug, and Doug looking for any excuse to make someone's life miserable. Well, you go ahead and do what you have to do, he said, stepping closer. But if you or anyone from your HOA so much as steps foot on my land again, I'll be calling the sheriff for trespassing. Karen's expression cracked just slightly, a flicker of frustration crossing her face before she masked it again. You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. No, Jake said, voice steady. I think you are. With that, he turned his back on her and walked away, leaving her and her lackeys. Standing there, he could almost hear her teeth grinding as she stormed back to her car. That should have been the end of it, but as Jake would soon learn, Karen wasn't the type to take no for an answer. She had declared war, and she wasn't backing down. The first sign that Karen was escalating things came in the form of an official-looking envelope slipped into Jake's mailbox under the cover of darkness. He found it early the next morning while grabbing the mail, the HOA logo stamped smugly in the top left corner. The sheer audacity made him chuckle. They really thought a few fancy words on letterhead were going to scare him. Inside, the letter outlined a list of violations his farm was allegedly committing, each one more ridiculous than the last. Unapproved exterior color. The red barn clashes with neighborhood aesthetics. Excessive noise pollution. Rooster crowing before 8 a.m. is disruptive. Unauthorized livestock. Goats, cows, and chickens are not allowed within community guidelines. Failure to maintain property landscaping. An untrimmed field presents a disorderly environment. The kicker, a demand that he cease and desist all non-compliant activities within 7 days or face legal action. Jake burst out laughing right there on his porch, nearly spilling his coffee. The HOA had zero legal authority over his land, yet Karen was still trying to act like she ran the county. Instead of replying, he tacked the letter onto his fridge like a trophy and went about his day. But that was just the beginning. Days later, county inspectors started showing up one after another. First came the health department, then the zoning commission, then animal welfare services. Each time, Jake would greet them with a smirk, knowing full well what was going on. The health department official, an older man named Roger, took one look at Jake's spotless animal pens and said, "Son, I don't know who you pissed off, but they've got us running in circles. This is the cleanest farm I've inspected in months." Jake chuckled. Wouldn't happen to be a certain HOA president sending you, would it? Roger exhaled sharply. Can't say officially, but off the record, yes. Her name's on every complaint. They shook hands and Roger left, grumbling about entitled busybodies with too much time on their hands. But Karen wasn't done. Handwritten complaints started appearing in Jake's mailbox, unaddressed and signed, but written in the same aggressive, passive-aggressive style Karen was so fond of. Your farm smell is making our property values plummet. Please be considerate of your neighbors. The sight of farm animals is distressing to young children. Consider fencing them off from public view. A well-kept lawn is a sign of respect. Mow the fields or expect further action. Jake was starting to get genuinely impressed by the sheer pettiness on display. Then things took a turn. One afternoon, while repairing a section of his wooden fence, Jake heard the unmistakable sound of a chainsaw roaring to life. The noise wasn't coming from his property. It was coming from the highway side near the boundary line. Curious and suspicious, he set down his tools and walked over to investigate. What he saw made his blood boil. A group of HOA-hired workers were putting up a fence on his land. Not just any fence, but a high steel gray monstrosity designed to block off the view of his farm. They were cutting through a section of his private property line, acting like they owned it. And who was supervising, clipboard in hand and a smug smile on her face? Karen. Jake strode up, voice like steel. What the hell do you think you're doing? Karen turned, feigning surprise, her expression a perfect blend of fake poise and condescension. Oh, Mr. Mitchell, just implementing some community improvements, she gestured toward the workers. This new privacy fence will help protect the visual harmony of Crestwood Estates. Jake gestured at the men cutting into his property. This fence is on my land. Karen's smile didn't falter. Well, that's debatable. You see, the community has reviewed older survey maps, and we believe the original property lines were drawn incorrectly. Since your farm borders our neighborhood, it's in everyone's best interest to adjust accordingly. Jake's fingers curled into fists. They were literally trying to steal his land. You believe the property lines were incorrect? He repeated, voice dangerously calm. Yes, Karen said smoothly. And until we receive further clarification, we're proceeding with this improvement project. Jake took a slow, deliberate step forward, locking eyes with the workers. You boys got a permit for this? One of them hesitated before muttering, the highway told us they had all the legal permissions. Jake smirked. They don't. And if you don't pack up and leave in the next 5 minutes, you're trespassing, which means I'll be calling the sheriff, and you'll be the ones in legal trouble. That did it. The workers exchanged nervous glances before one of them shut off the chainsaw. They started gathering their equipment, clearly not willing to go to jail for an overzealous HOA. Karen, however, was livid. You can't just order them to leave, she snapped. This is a community decision. Jake pulled out his phone and, in full view of everyone, started dialing the sheriff's number. Then let's make it official and have the county sort out. Karen said, there's no need for that, she said stiffly. Jake crossed his arms. Then you'd best tell your people to pack it up. With a murderous glare, Karen finally signaled for the workers to leave. The fence project was dead before it had even begun. But Jake didn't stop there. That night, he dug through his property deed, found the official surveyor's map, and made copies. The next morning, he sent it along with a formal cease and desist letter directly to the highway board, making it crystal clear that if anyone from the HOA stepped foot on his land again, he'd press trespassing charges. For a few days, it seemed like Karen had finally backed down. Off then, exactly 1 week later, Jake woke up to find a massive for sale sign planted on his property. It was positioned near the road, looking as if his farm was suddenly on the market. Beneath it, a second sign read, under negotiation, coming soon Crestwood Estates expansion. Jake stared at the sign in disbelief, turning into rage. Karen had tried to claim his farm was part of Crestwood's new development. He stormed over, ripped the sign out of the ground, and stomped back to his porch. Before he could even call the HOA office, Karen herself pulled up in her SUV, stepping out with her usual air of forced politeness. Oh, good morning, Mr. Mitchell, she chirped, as if they were old friends. I see you noticed the sign. There's been a bit of a misunderstanding, I'm sure. Jake folded his arms. Karen's eyes gleamed. We at the HOA have been in discussions about acquiring nearby properties for future expansion. Some realtors assumed your farm was included in the new Crestwood development, and the sign was placed prematurely. Jake's jaw clenched. So you're telling me a real estate agency just accidentally put a for sale sign on my land? Karen's smile faltered slightly. Well, perhaps there was some enthusiasm about the prospect. Jake took a slow step forward. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to call whoever put that sign up and tell them to never set foot on my property again. Because if I see one more, I won't be tearing it down. I'll be suing the entire HOA for fraud. Karen paled, and for the first time, Jake saw fear in her eyes. Jake had always been a patient man. Farming teaches you that, waiting for seeds to grow, for storms to pass, for animals to settle. But patience had its limits, and Karen had stomped all over them when she tried to claim his land as part of her HOA's expansion. Jake realized something. She wasn't going to stop until she won. What she didn't know was that Jake didn't lose fights on his own land. It was time to push back. The first thing he did was get ahead of her tactics. He drove into town straight to the county records office and requested every single document related to his farm. Deeds, zoning approvals, land use permits, everything. If Karen wanted to play dirty, Jake was going to make sure he had legal ammunition ready. The clerk, an older man named Tom, looked over the request and shook his head. You ain't the first landowner she's pulled this on. Jake raised an eyebrow. She tried this before? Tom sighed. A couple years back, she pushed an HOA expansion into another neighborhood. Got a few folks to sell out, but the ones who didn't, well, she harassed them until they did. Jake leaned forward. What happened to the ones who held out? Tom grinned. Karen lost, and now that I think about it, she's about to lose again. Jake smirked. Good to know. Once he had his paperwork in order, Jake made his next move, calling the sheriff. Sheriff Tom Caldwell had been a family friend for years, and when Jake explained what was going on, the lawman, and let out a low whistle. You're telling me she put a for sale sign on your land? The sheriff asked, rubbing his jaw. Damn right she did. Well, hell, that's straight up fraud. Jake nodded. That's what I figured. Sheriff Caldwell sighed. Look, I can't arrest her for being a pain in the ass, but I can put the fear of God in her. Next time she or any of her highway goons trespass on your land, you call me. I'll handle it. Jake grinned. You know I will. Now, it was Jake's turn to be petty. Karen had complained about his rooster. Fine, Jake bought 3 more. The next morning at 5 a.m. sharp, 4 roosters let out a symphony of crowing, their voices carrying all the way into Crestwood Estate. Jake sat on his porch, sipping coffee and smiling as lights flicked on in the distant houses. Welcome to the countryside, HOA. But he wasn't done. Karen had whined about his farmland being an eyesore. Fine, Jake went out and planted an entire field of bright yellow sunflowers right along the property line, so tall and dense that they completely blocked the HOA's view of anything past them. One afternoon, as Jake worked near the edge of his field, he heard an outraged screech from the other side of the sunflowers. Karen, she stormed up, fuming. Mr. Mitchell, what is this? She demanded, gesturing wildly at the flowers. Jake grinned. Just doing some landscaping improvements, ma'am. Thought I'd, make things a little more aesthetic. Karen's face turned red. You can't just block off the view like this. Jake tilted his head. Thought privacy fences were a good thing. You sure try to put one up. Karen spluttered, fists clenching. This is not over. Jake gave her a friendly nod. Have a nice day, Karen. She stormed off. That was the last time she ever mentioned the barn. But Jake's masterstroke came when he went on the offensive. Karen wanted to make his farm a nuisance. Fine, he was about to make it the most popular place in town. He called up his old buddy Mason, who ran the local farmer's market. They sat on Jake's porch sipping beer as they hatched a plan. What if we turn the farm into an event? Mason suggested. Something big, something fun. Jake grinned. I like the way you think. The next day, flyers went up all over town. Farmer's Fun Day, free entry. Come meet the animals, enjoy fresh produce, and support local farmers. By the weekend, dozens of families rolled in, kids running around petting goats, adults buying fresh eggs and milk, local musicians playing country music. Jake had never seen so many smiling faces on his land before. But Karen had never been more furious. She came storming onto the property in the middle of the event, arms flailing. This is unacceptable, she shrieked. You can't just turn your farm into a public spectacle. Jake leaned against a fence post, grinning. Oh, but I can. See, I checked with the county. My property is fully zoned for agritourism. Karen's eye twitched. But the noise, the traffic. Jake shrugged. All legal. And folks seemed to love it. He gestured toward the happy crowd. The kids were playing with baby chicks. The musicians were strumming their guitars. Karen's hands trembled. You haven't heard the last of this, she spat, but she was losing control. Then came the final straw. One evening, Jake noticed a drone flying over his property. He narrowed his eyes. Someone was spying on him. The next day, a new HOA letter appeared in his mailbox, this one claiming he was violating animal welfare standards. Jake had had enough. He called his lawyer, had a full cease and desist order drafted, and marched straight into the HOA board meeting. The second he walked through the doors, the entire room went silent. Karen, sitting at the head of the table, went pale. Jake didn't say a word. He just dropped the legal papers onto the table and crossed his arms. You've been harassing me, trespassing on my land, filing false complaints, and now you're sending people to spy on me? Karen's voice wobbled. That's a ridiculous accusation. Jake smirked. Really? Because I have security footage of your investigators snooping around. The room erupted in whispers. Even Karen's allies looked uncomfortable. Jake jabbed a finger at the documents. This is a legal notice. If you don't stop immediately, I'll be suing not just the HOA, but you personally for harassment, defamation, and illegal surveillance. Karen's face went from red to ghostly white. A few HOA board members shifted uncomfortably. One older woman coughed. Karen, maybe we should just let this go. He's not even in the HOA. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. Jake leaned forward, his voice low and firm. You came onto my land, tried to steal it, tried to shut me down. You didn't think I'd fight back. Karen said nothing. Jake chuckled, grabbing his hat. You have a nice evening now. And with that, he walked out, leaving a stunned, silent HOA board in his wake. Karen wasn't done fighting, but neither was Jake, and the final battle was about to begin. Karen had built her little empire on fear for years. The HOA board had followed her command. Homeowners had tiptoed around her rules, and Crestwood Estates had been her personal kingdom. But like any tyrant, she had pushed too far, and now the kingdom was starting to revolt. The first sign of trouble for Karen came in the form of an emergency HOA meeting. She had called it herself, intending to rally support and tighten her grip on the board after Jake's legal threats. Instead, it became a public tribunal. Crestwood's community center was packed that evening, far more than the usual turnout. Dozens of homeowners, many of whom had never bothered to attend before, were now crammed into the small room, muttering amongst themselves. The air was different this time. Karen strutted to the front of the room, clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. All right, she began, her usual commanding tone ringing through the space. Let's get started. Richard, the HOA president, sat at the center of the table, flipping through a stack of papers. His expression was unreadable. Abel, but then Greg, the veteran who had leaked the internal HOA emails to Jake, stood up. Before we do, Greg said, his deep voice cutting through the room, I think we need to address the real issue. Karen's lips thinned as Greg turned, sweeping his gaze across the room. We've got documented evidence that Karen's been using our HOA funds for personal legal battles. She tried to use HOA money to file complaints against a man who doesn't even live here. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen stiffened. That's a gross misrepresentation of... Then let's talk about the fake complaints you file with the county, Greg interrupted. We have emails. You made up names, asterisk, lied to make it look like there was an overwhelming demand to take Jake's farm down. The murmurs grew louder. And let us not forget, Linda added from the front row, the for sale sign you had put on his land. I don't know about the rest of you, but I don't think we should be supporting an HOA president who's out here committing fraud. A murmur became a full-blown uproar. This is ridiculous, Karen snapped, eyes darting around the room. Her power was slipping. Everything I've done is to protect this community. Richard finally spoke. Karen, he said, his voice quieter but carrying more weight than anyone else in the room. We've received a legal cease and desist letter from Jake Mitchell's lawyer, and frankly, I think he has a case. Karen's face drained of color. You can't be serious. Richard sighed. You've made this personal, and now the entire HOA is at risk of being sued. Someone in the back called out, she's the real liability here. More voices rose in agreement. Karen realized what was happening. She had lost control of the narrative. So, like any cornered predator, she tried one final desperate move. She flipped it back on Jake. If we let him get away with this, she declared, voice rising, our property values will plummet. The farm will expand, bringing in strangers, loud, dirty events, animals wandering too close. Karen, Richard's voice was sharp. She stopped. We're voting, he said, staring her down. Right now. The room went still. The HOA board members, once Karen's loyal lackeys, glanced at each other nervously. It was clear if they stuck with her, they were going down with the ship. Richard cleared his throat. All in favor of removing Karen Whitmore from her position as HOA enforcer? A single hand went up, then another, then every single board member's hand. Karen froze, her face twisted in pure disbelief. You can't do this, she whispered. Linda smirked. Looks like we just did. For the first time in years, Karen was powerless. And it wasn't just the HOA board turning on her. The homeowners, her former subjects, were staring at her like a fallen dictator. Richard stood, grabbing a paper from the table. As of tonight, Karen, he said, sliding it toward her, you are no longer authorized to represent this HOA in any capacity. Karen just sat there, hands trembling. Her kingdom had fallen. Alan Jake was sitting on his porch the next morning when the for sale sign went up in front of Karen's house. He grinned. She wasn't just leaving the HOA, she was leaving the neighborhood. But Jake wasn't quite done yet. He had one final gift for Crestwood Estates. That afternoon, a new sign appeared, planted right along his property line where every resident of the HOA could see it. Big, bold, welcome to Mitchell Farms HOA. Free since 1923, no Karens allowed. The next morning, people from all over town were driving by just to take pictures of it. It became a local landmark. Jake sat back, coffee in hand, listening to his roosters crow proudly in the background. For the first time in months, he felt pure peace. With Karen gone, peace finally returned to Crestwood Estates. For years, homeowners had lived under her tyrannical rule, terrified of absurd fines and ridiculous restrictions. But now, the neighborhood changed overnight. Lawns that had once been meticulously measured to HOA standards started showing personality. Some people planted wildflowers. Others put up decorations that Karen would have lost her mind over. Kids who had been banned from riding bikes in the streets were suddenly everywhere, laughing and playing. People stopped living in fear of some self-appointed dictator with a clipboard. And Jake was thriving. A week after Karen's departure, the new HOA board, now under actual reasonable leadership, sent Jake a formal apology letter. He read it once, smirked, and tacked it right next to Karen's old cease and desist letter, framing them both like trophies. It was poetic, but the best part? Some of the very same HOA members who had once complained about his farm were now his customers. They started showing up at his farmer's market buying fresh produce, chatting with him about gardening, even bringing their kids to pet the animals. Linda, the former board member who had helped expose Karen, showed up with a fresh-baked pecan pie. She handed it to Jake with a smirk. Consider this a peace offering. Jake leaned against his porch railing, taking a bite. Damn, he said, I never thought I'd live to see the day an HOA apologizes. Linda laughed. Let's just say, without Karen breathing down our necks, things are a little different. One of the others, a quiet man named Ted, scratched his head awkwardly. Truth is, Jake, he admitted, most of us never had a problem with your farm. We just didn't want to end up on Karen's hit list. Jake nodded. Understandable, he said, finishing his pie. Then he smirked. As long as no one tries to annex my land again, I think we can call it truce. They laughed, and just like that, years of hostility faded away. But karma? Karma wasn't done with Karen. A few weeks later, news started circulating through town. Karen had moved into another HOA-run community, thinking she could start fresh. But what she hadn't realized was that this HOA already had an enforcer, a woman just as strict, just as power-hungry, just as much of a control freak as Karen. Karen found herself on the receiving end of the exact same nonsense she had inflicted on others. She got fined for her grass being half an inch too high. She got reported for parking too close to the curb. And the best part? When she tried to assert herself, demanding a spot in the new HOA leadership, she was shut down so fast it made her head spin. By the time Jake heard about it, Karen had already put her new house up for sale. Again, poetic justice at its finest. Meanwhile, back at Mitchell Farms, life was better than ever. Jake's farmer's market expanded into a full-fledged event, drawing people from all over town. Local musicians played live country music, families came out to enjoy fresh produce, and the farm became a community gathering spot. Even some of the former HOA members became regulars, happily buying eggs and vegetables from the very farm Karen had tried to destroy. Jake never saw Karen again, but every now and then as he sat on his porch sipping coffee, he'd glance over at the sign by his property line, the one reminding everyone that Mitchell Farms was a Karen-free zone. And he'd smile because, in the end, karma had done exactly what it was supposed to.